Perfect. Well, hello everybody and welcome to Dublin and The Hague virtually. Thank you very much for joining us for this webinar today. My name is Orla McBreen. I'm Director of Civil Society at Ireland's Foreign Ministry, and I'm very pleased to be hosting this, this webinar both as with my Irish hat on, but also as co-chair of the task team for CSO Development Effectiveness and Enabling Environment. Well, just before we start, I think everybody is used to Zoom and Zoom etiquette, and I think you've all anticipated me and have the microphones off, but just a reminder of that. And to let you know, for anybody who's tweeting, that we're using the hashtag #TaskTeamSDG17. So I want to thank you all, those of you who are in New York and in the Americas. It's the morning. We have some people dialing in from Asia, which is pretty late in the evening. So you are really dedicated to the cause of civil society and of SDG 17. And I know many of you might be in the office, but a lot more are at kitchen tables or children's bedrooms and dealing with the impact of COVID. And just we want to say on behalf of ourselves and the task team, we hope that you and your families are safe and well, and we recognise what a difficult time this is for everybody. The reason that the task team wanted to have this conversation about SDG 17, and we had a session last year where we called SDG 17 the forgotten SDG. I think something that the pandemic has showed us, that if we're to achieve all of the SDGs and if we're to beat COVID-19 and get through this, civil society is essential to allow us to do that. So the task team, which is a multi-stakeholder group representing donors, partner countries and civil society all on an equal basis, we look at the international commitments that all of us have made over the years to support civil society and now translate them to say, how can we live up to those commitments and ensure that civil society are included at the heart of the SDGs. And at the meeting today, we're going to bring some evidence to test whether this has been adequately achieved. And then we will have a panel discussion to see what are the solutions we can look to improve this situation. So we've got a distinguished panel of speakers, and I will introduce them as we go along, because I know everybody's just looking on the small screen and it's hard to retain all the names. But our first speaker has come directly from our temporary parliament, and I'm really delighted to introduce him. He's very new in the role. I think this might be one of his first international meetings, and I'm very pleased that he's been able to join us. So I'd like to now invite our Minister, Minister Eamon Ryan, who is both Minister for, I'm trying to get the list here now on my other computer, Minister for Climate Action, Communications Networks and Transport, and also leader of our Green Party and in this country. And he's also responsible for the SDGs in Ireland. So Minister, I'll hand over to you now.
Orla, thank you very much, and good afternoon everyone in Asia and Europe and the States, in Africa, and all points in between and beyond. I'm thrilled to be here and to give this keynote address from the Irish government, which I'm proud to be represent. I'm delighted particularly for you all this afternoon to be joining a virtual side event. I know it'd be great to be back meeting in person, but it is important we meet virtually if we can't travel, on this important role of civil society organisations in the delivery of the Sustainable Development Goals. These difficult and strange times have been a reminder of the importance of community, both at home and globally. Civil society in all its formations, whether it's a group sitting under a tree, a sports club, volunteers, or large multi-million-dollar NGO, notwithstanding the challenges and hardships that this global pandemic has brought, it is our communities, our sense of civility and society, which is helping us overcome these challenges. This virus is a reminder to all of us that global problems need global solutions. The Sustainable Development Goals are a global solution to the problems of everyone, everywhere. They are universal, they apply to all of us, not just some of us. When 5 years ago, Ireland, along with Kenya, facilitated the negotiations which agreed to the Sustainable Development Goals, we agreed on robust measures of collective progress towards their delivery. We each need to report on achievements and on areas where continued work is needed. The SDGs were ambitious when they were agreed. We should be happy with the challenges that they set each of us, a challenge to do better for ourselves, our families, our communities, our countries, our continents, and especially our home, this rock we call Earth. While the urgent need to respond to COVID-19 may make delivering on our ambition in the SDGs perhaps a greater challenge than we thought, fulfilling the promise of Agenda 2030 would make responding to any future pandemic so much easier. I see civil society at the heart of the journey over the next decade in delivering the SDGs. Civil society is the glue that links all the partnerships together and importantly ensures that we are all accountable. We cannot deliver on our promise to ourselves without you. Climate change is the existential challenge of our generation. It's a challenge faced by all, locally, nationally, and globally. However, in many cases, it is those who have contributed the least to our climate change pandemic who are impacted the most and who are already feeling the effects of its catastrophic consequences. Essential that we advance our collective action and give a refreshed impetus to combating climate change. Sustainable development solutions can only come from working in partnership, as SDG 17 envisages. This includes all actors, from international institutions and multilateral agencies to civil society organizations and the private sector, as well as, of course, national governments. I'd like to acknowledge the role being played by the OECD Development Assistance Committee in highlighting the efforts that DAC members are making towards providing the type of support and engagement that civil society organizations need to operate effectively. We also look forward to working with the DAC on the development of a policy instrument on civil society. As measured by the OECD DAC, Ireland has consistently been one of the top donor countries providing development assistance to and through civil society as part of our international development programme. But partnership with civil society actors is not just a foreign policy objective, it's also a domestic priority. My department in Ireland is responsible for bringing together all facets of government to develop national policy in relation to SDG implementation, to prepare our voluntary national reviews, and to engage civil society in all of this work. We also convene a national SDG stakeholder forum to inform further development of our national SDG framework. This forum also provides an opportunity for civil society to input and challenge Ireland's own performance on our path to reach the SDGs. Internationally, Ireland champions the role of civil society organisations and calls for a safe and enabling environment in which they can operate effectively. Since 2013, together with a cross-regional core group of states, Chile, Japan, Sierra Leone, and Tunisia, we have led on initiatives on civil society space at the UN Human Rights Council. Last month, we delivered a joint statement at the HRC on behalf of over 40 countries and civil society organisations, which highlighted the essential role of civil society in responding to and rebuilding from the COVID-19 crisis, and stressing the needs for states to promote and protect civic space. There can hardly be an area of our lives that has not been affected by COVID-19, and civil society organisations are no exception. The pandemic has highlighted, if any confirmation was needed, that civil society partners are development actors in their own right. The work of CSOs in ameliorating its worst excesses of the pandemic by delivering much needed services to the most vulnerable is essential. Excessive restrictions on civil society space, particularly restrictions on the media or on human rights defenders, will hinder rather than combat the impact of COVID-19. This virtual event is an opportunity to understand better the gaps in our SDG frameworks, which do not sufficiently include civil society partnerships. While the increasing restrictions on civil society space, including in response to COVID-19, are discouraging, there is an opportunity to do better. Your meeting today is a chance to galvanize support for the effort to ensure that civil society participates fully in our national processes to achieve the SDGs. You will shortly have the opportunity to hear from the UN Special Rapporteur on Peaceful Assembly, Clement Voul, on the need to engage all partners for SDG implementation. and how the UN system can support us, especially at country level, all in doing this. I want to congratulate the Special Rapporteur on the 10th anniversary of his mandate, which has been marked all this week by a series of seminars related to the freedom of peaceful assembly. Today, we want to begin the discussion on how we can measure properly the contributions that CSOs make to the delivery of the SDGs. Currently, there's no specific indicator for SDG 17 dedicated to measuring the inclusion and participation of civil society organizations, which should be at the heart of SDG 17, whose title is Partnership for the Goals. I'm pleased that the Interagency and Expert Group on SDGs of the UN Statistical Commission has signalled an openness to considering an indicator on civil society partnerships. Refinement of the SDG monitoring framework will be a technical process requiring agreed statistical methods. This work itself might not catch the headlines, however, measurement is a really important part of success. Being able to show the journey travelled on the way to 2030 will be essential to making arguments for scarce resources to demonstrate that working together is better and more efficient. I hope that one practical outcome of today's side event is to generate more support for this effort to design, test, and agree a new indicator for SDG 17 in time for implementation between 2025 and 2030. Ireland was honoured and deeply humbled to have been elected to the Security Council last month. One of our central themes in our candidacy was partnership. In all our work at the UN, we tend to continue to prioritise partnerships, especially with civil society, to deliver on the promise of Agenda 2030. I hope you will have a fruitful and engaging discussion today, which will identify the next steps we all need to take to close the gap, and to ensure civil society is fully included in our collective effort to reach our shared global goals. Thank you, everyone. I wish you every success today.
Thank you very much, Minister. A little bit of Irish for everybody watching. And thank you for setting the challenge for us that we have an opportunity to meet the challenges for civil society, and something really practical that we can all put our shoulder to the wheel to try and push forward is to have an indicator that measures that, because what gets measured gets done. So thank you again, Thank you. I think the Minister probably has to leave us shortly. He's got a busy agenda, unfortunately, but we'll keep him and his colleagues informed of the discussions here. And I'm now pleased to introduce, as the Minister said, the Special Rapporteur for the right of freedom of assembly and association, Monsieur Clément Vullet, who I think probably needs no introduction to those who've been working on civil society issues over recent years. He's joining us from Geneva and is going to, again, emphasize the need to include all partners in SDG implementation, but also reflect on how the UN can help those at country level through its convening role in terms of dialogue and partnership as well. So I think I saw Clément on the call, and I will pass the floor over to you there.
Thank you very much, and good morning, Minister, ladies and gentlemen, dear friends. I'm pleased to join this webinar among friends from civil society, government representative, and representative from the private sector to share some of the thoughts on the role of the civil society in the implementation of the 2030 Agenda for the Sustainable Development and SDG 17 in particular. Before I start, I would like to express my sincere appreciation to the task team for inviting me to participate as keynote speaker and for convening such important discussion. As most of you know, the enjoyment of the right to freedom of peaceful assembly and of association faces multiple threats globally. In many countries around the world, we are witnessing a closing of civic space characterized by oppressive law, criminalization of dissidents, and stigmatizing of activism and civil society. Despite this negative trend, we see in parallel that there is global process like 2030 Agenda, which envisions a key role for civil society in the achievement of all SDGs. The 2030 agenda places great emphasis on a global partnership working in the spirit of global solidarity. In so doing, it recognizes that it is not feasible for states to successfully implement the agenda without joint collaboration with other stakeholders. We know that partnerships are effective instruments for mobilizing human rights and financial resources, expertise, technology, and knowledge. As I have indicated in my last two reports to the General Assembly, and practical recommendation that I presented to the Human Rights Council last year, a thriving civil society that is able to exercise the right to assemble and associate freely plays a crucial role in those partnerships. Why? Civil society contributes to building partnership in many ways. For example, by producing and analyzing data, reviewing and shaping development policy based on their technical expertise, ensuring that the voices of marginalized and vulnerable populations are taken into account, providing access to remote location and underserved population, shedding light on ignored or underserved goals, and pushing for action, and raising awareness and bringing stakeholders together to tackle development challenge, including the Sustainable Development Goals. But for civil society to mobilize and collaborate effectively, certain conditions must be met. Partnership must be premised on the protection of fundamental freedoms, including freedoms of peaceful assembly, association, and expression, which means that an enable environment for the enjoyment of these rights needs to be in place. First, a key component of that enable environment is the freedom of civil society to operate autonomously. Association in very form, whether registration or unregistered, formal or informal, in the sphere of service delivery, advocacy, or oversight, should be able to freely conduct their activity as independent actors in order to effectively represent the need and aspiration of their constituency or beneficiaries. The ability of association to freely conduct their activity includes the ability to regulate their own governance without external interference, the enjoyment of the freedom of expression and opinion, as well as the right to access information and the ability to exercise those rights online and offline. For civil society, that means independence and determinant in their own priorities, program funding, internal governance, and staffing, among other things. Associations that operate freely are better able to participate effectively and to articulate the need of the community that they represent. Secondly, civil society actors should not be treated as extension of government departments or agencies that are thus bound by government priorities. For this partnership to be successful, civil society should be considered equal partners seeking a common objective. Stakeholders should share ownership and jointly develop the process, including in developing the agenda and the decision-making process. This is particularly important in the case of civil society groups working at the local and grassroots level, many of which are led by women. A recent report by the UN Women indicates that women local organizations are often asked to work in the hardest to reach places because they are often the only ones that can reach into those places, and yet their expertise and knowledge from doing this work is not actively engaged in program design, implementing, and accountability mechanism. This led me to the third point. There is a need to broaden the frame of focus and consider actors who will not typically engage in development or human rights or are not given sufficient prominence or capacity, such as community group, grassroots organization, trade union, and social movements, as well as local government and municipal authority. This can enrich the development process and promote the inclusiveness that is so crucial to fulfill the Sustainable Development Goal. Indeed, partnership between local civil society and local governments and municipals should be given more consideration when developing democratic capacity and could be a key factor in promoting and enable the work on implementing the the 2030 agenda, in particular goal 17. Finally, I have stressed that partnership that offer opportunity for formal engagement between civil society, government, and other key stakeholders should be maximized. Forums such as the Open Government Partnership, for example, need to be strengthened and leveraged, in particular in their effort to encourage the meaningful engagement of the citizen. And we know that COVID-19 gives this renewed urgency to this issue. In April, I called on governments and key stakeholders to recognize that they could not solve this crisis alone, that civil society organizations should be seen as strategic partners in the fight against the pandemic. I developed a set of 10 principles and recommendations on how to ensure civil society can participate and partner with different actors in terms of helping to frame inclusive policy, disseminating information, building shared and corporate approach, and providing social support to the vulnerable. Unfortunately, this is not happening. In some countries, what we are seeing is new restriction to civic space during the pandemic. Civil society needs to be a partner. As I said to member states during my interactive dialogue with the Council last week, the effectiveness of measures to defeat the COVID-19 outbreak depends on the ability of government to secure people participation and trust. There is a well-documented correlation between the violation of public freedom, including association and assembly expression, on the one hand, and the erosion of the government credibility and the risk of conflicts on the other hand. By contrast, respect for this fundamental freedom can empower community to respond and adapt to change brought by the crisis and to better prepare for similar emergency in future. What can the UN do in the context? Given the growing number and severity of threats to civic space, many entities within the UN, including mine, have come to realize the pressing need to strengthen their efforts and provide a more comprehensive response to the problem. However, there is much more to be done. First, the UN, the United Nations should lead efforts to provide a human rights approach to development, and the right to peaceful assembly and association should be at the center. This means promoting the creation of an enabling environment for civil society to operate. The UN, there should be a coherence throughout the whole UN system and a coherent approach. This cannot be a second thought. It should be a coherent approach. Second, the UN should take steps to ensure civil society organizations can continue to participate in all policy decisions, including those related to the COVID-19 response, especially in the case of public-private partnership. Finally, and with this, I conclude, the UN can make available fast, flexible funding to civil society partners, including through the UN COVID-19 Global Humanitarian Response. And I believe funding should be prioritized for women-led organizations who are on the front line of health and humanitarian action and often underestimated. I look forward to our discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Clément, so much for setting the scene for us and for including some of those who are not always to the forefront, particularly women's organizations. You made that point at the beginning, and then in terms of what the UN can do and what all of us can do together. And I think it links very well to the next section, because in order to know what we have to do and where the gaps are, we need evidence. So the task team commissioned Professors Alan Fowler and Case Beekart, who I'm going to invite to speak next, to publish a study, which we are in fact formally launching at this event. And this is on the identification of factors that help and hinder the engagement of CSOs in the implementation of the SDGs. So both professors are professors at the International Institute of Social Studies, in Rotterdam, Erasmus University Rotterdam. I'm going to invite Dr. Kees Piekert to speak first. He's calling from Rotterdam, and then we'll hand over to Annan Fowler, who I think is joining us from South Africa. But Kees, we'll start with you. And I see you have the presentation up already. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Orla. I'm calling from The Hague in the Netherlands, but that's very close to Rotterdam, where the ISS is located. And thank you very much for giving us the floor. We would like to briefly share some of the results of a study that we have done in the last 2 years. We started in early 2019. And completed this study just before the Corona lockdown. We were very lucky in March. The study focused on the identification of factors which help and hinder the engagement of civil society organizations in the implementation of the Sustainable Development Goals. So this idea of the study came from the task team, but was submitted to ISS as an independent entity to do it. We've been involved in previous studies which focused on interlocutors in multi-stakeholder processes, as well as ownership. So the whole study, as you said, was focused to achieve basically 2 objectives. On the one hand, providing empirical information on the relationship between enabling environment and civil society engagement as a contribution to realizing the SDGs. And on the other hand, also to inform policy outputs at critical moments, which we are doing today and we have done also in previous settings. So I put up this map, which is from Civicus, which shows different levels of opening of civic space, which was very important because this was one of the 2 frameworks that we looked at. Civic space on the one hand, on the other hand, we linked that to the 4-part framework of the task team, which will come back into the discussion. Of course, we could not sort of look at the whole world, but we wanted to have sort of country-specific evidence and results. And we looked at basically 6 countries that were spread over these 5 categories that Civicus identifies and gives color to. So the first one, and I'm putting the first one is here, Costa Rica, which is an open sort of civic space, an open sort of society. We looked at Ghana, which is narrowed. We looked at Hungary, which is obstructed. As well as Nepal. We also looked at, as Tanzania. There is a more repressed country involved in terms of civic space, which was Nepal, and the 6th country was Laos, People's Democratic Republic. So we focused on 6 countries, identified altogether 21 case studies in these countries. And why did we sort of look at these very different countries? That's often a question. We wanted to have inputs from different regions. We wanted to have different sort of levels of civic space, as I indicated, also different income levels, various sort of activities of international donors. So there was the diversity would give us a good picture of what is happening in terms of civil society engagement with the SDGs. So we worked with local researchers, and I'm very pleased to see that a few of the researchers that we worked with are online as well. We met together in March, so it's nice to see that they are here and they're welcome to give their inputs as well. All very familiar with SDG processes, with multi-stakeholder processes, experienced researchers, some of them linked to NGOs, and some of them actually to government. So we had very interesting discussions throughout the research process. So what did we ask ourselves? The question was, what do differences in a country's civic space mean for the engagement of civil society organizations in implementing the Sustainable Development Goals? And maybe it is a good idea to recall what roles CSOs actually have played, roughly 4. First, more giving information about purpose and diversity of SDGs, especially at local and remote levels, is often not very well developed. Secondly, through advocacy efforts, supporting and encouraging governments to be committed to their implementation plans. Third, CSO contributed directly by also realizing their own service delivery projects in many areas, which are highlighted by the SDGs. And the final area, which is cross-cutting, is that civil society organizations with their strong local roots also contribute to bottom-up monitoring of sustainable development goals as part of a wider but often limited national reporting process. However, in order to contribute to all these various ways of SDG implementation, civil society organizations need to operate freely as societal actors. And there we've seen they encounter several limitations. We actually found more processes of autocratizations rather than democratization. In at least 50 countries worldwide, civil society groups encounter serious constraints, as we all can see in the map. Other restrictions relate to freedom of expression, freedom of peaceful assembly, association, as well as access to justice. So this is central in the Agenda 2030, where all signatories have committed themselves to guarantee effective, accountable, and transparent institutions, as well as responsive, inclusive, participatory, and representative decision-making. So this whole expansion of the enabling environment for civil society includes, amongst other priorities, the official advancement of policies and practices, allowing these organizations to enjoy more open, legal, regulatory, and political frameworks, which guarantees these freedoms of expression, association, and assembly. So therefore, the role of civil society organizations will be enhanced if these liberties are guaranteed and institutionalized. So that was sort of the context and the setting in which we started. Now I hand over to Alan to sort of tell us what we found. We have a short time, we can talk a lot about it. So Alan, over to you.
Thank you. Can everybody hear me okay?
Yes, we can.
Welcome from lockdown, South African style. As you'll be pleased to maybe hear, alcohol sales have been banned again, but I did stock up. Let me give you a sort of a rundown. It's going to be 7 or 8 different major findings. It's important to bear in mind that as a matter of sort of organized design of the research, the starting point was the 4-part framework that the task team had already constructed. So we didn't try and create something new, but it does mean that we've had to work within that framework, where the first of the major parts is collaboration in multi-stakeholder dialogues. And that oriented us in automatically to looking at how dialogues work, and not all the facets of civil society engagement in SDGs. We didn't do field surveys. We focused on what the task team's framework offered us. So, and as Case has explained, we're looking across 6 countries with 5 different types of space as identified by Civicus, but also by other researchers. It's not just Civicus. There are many attempts to try and provide indicators, to try and look at what is going on in a society in terms of enabling environment, etc. So while Civicus is what we started with, let's recognize there are many others who also are working on similar topics. So what the first thing we found was SDGs do work across different civic spaces. Whether the space is open or closed, governments have taken on board, in principle anyway, their commitment at the UN. Where these commitments are located in terms of public administration varies. You cannot say it's all located in the Office of the President or it's all located in the Ministry of Finance and Planning. Each country places their coordination of SDG work in different places for their public administration, but they all have one. And it's also important to note that in none of the countries that we have researched was there any prohibition on government agencies working with CSOs. There was nothing legally stopping a government agency, a department, a ministry from working and engaging with civil society organizations. So that's a very positive sign. There is nothing to stop a government working with civil societies. What we've also found, which is the second item, is that to the extent that you might have anticipated that donors changed the ways that they interfaced with civil society organizations, with the introduction of the SDGs coming from the MDGs, we really didn't find much in alteration of how donors interface and the aid system interfaces with civil society organizations. We didn't find attention to funding baskets. We didn't find over-coupling coordination mechanisms between donors to ensure that there was no duplication, etc. The whole approach towards competitive bidding and the way that you finance civil society organizations remained more or less the same. So the SDGs do not seem, in the countries that we've looked at, to alter very much the way that donors work. In terms of CSO engagement, and it's been reflected in the previous talks, the heterogeneity of civil society organizations, which Civicus recognizes in terms of environmental groups, women's groups, farmers associations, simply are seldom to be seen in multi-stakeholder dialogues for SDGs. Predominantly, the setting is urban, and predominantly, its organizations are somehow or the other related to the aid system. So the heterogeneity of civil society we didn't find reflected in the participation in MSDs. That's partly because governments also have an active role in including and excluding civil society organizations they do or don't like. So it's not simply civil society organizations not getting their act together across the board, but there are other intervening factors that governments are much more in control of. But basically, an underrepresentation of the heterogeneity of civil society as it exists in the country. What we did see is that when civil society space becomes more open, and this was the example of Ghana and of Costa Rica, what you start to see is civil society organizations being associated with political actors and political parties. And why not? That happens everywhere. Some are considered to be more progressive, some are considered to be more conservative, etc., etc. But what that can mean is that the solidarity that one would hope to have between civil society organizations gets weakened because they get associated with a particular political stream or a political party, which can weaken solidarity in more open spaces, which was to some extent to be anticipated, I would think, if you look at open societies in Europe. You have alignments, perceived alignments between a particular civil society organization and a particular party or government or ideology. What obviously comes across as civic space shrinks, one of the major reasons is mistrust between civil society organizations, not all of them, and regimes. And again, this is to some extent common sense. Every country has its own legacies and has its own latencies in reactions around how a social contract, excuse me, how a social contract gets negotiated between citizen and state. And it can lead to situations of mistrust. And that's, I think, a common hindering factor that we find as regimes, as spaces close down. Trust is a common reason that you will find behind it. governments that constrain civic space tend to rely on similar or common instruments. Some was already been cited by the keynote speaker: stigmatization, delegitimization, legislation as an obstacle to registration, restrictions on financing, limiting access to information, inviting and ignoring CSO inputs. So you've got sort of CSO washing, if I can put it that way. So there is a sort of a repertoire that governments that want to close civic space tend to rely on, which is similar across countries. One before the end, the resourcing for civil society is becoming more privatized, which is partly the intention of SDG 1717 anyway, to mobilize additional finance for implementation of SDGs. And that's also the case towards civil society organizations. We see more private philanthropies, we see high net worth individuals. We start to see a much diversification of the resourcing availability beyond official aid, including diaspora financing, which can be quite a significant amount, more the official aid system is producing. So I think this notion of privatization, which is what SDG 1717 aims for, is visible. The last theme, excuse me again, the task team's four-part framework. The result of all the foregoing suggests that it's worthwhile for the task team to stand back and look at their four-part framework. Partly because there is a hierarchy between the four parts. They are all connected. No one part belongs to one particular stakeholder, although there's an inference that donors, number 3 belongs to donors, but that is becoming much more fluid. Which is part of it. Another part of it is SDGs are meant to be universal. So why don't we have ministries of finance in the task team, for example, not just the aid part, because it's universal. Every country is meant to be implementing SDGs. So one could again rethink of, is it time to relook at sort of the membership? So let me stop there, and I'm sure there's going to be lots of questions. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you very much to both of you, to Alan and Kees, and that's been really interesting. You've first set out the methodology, and I think what's been really important is that it's an international, cross-regional spread, and not with the Millennium Development Goals only looking at developing countries, but looking at all of us. You've also given us in the task team some homework to do, and there's quite a lot of members listening in, as well as a broader range of civil society. So I think that will be part of our homework for the next year or so, and we will have, even if we can't meet in person, we will certainly take that forward. There's a range of findings there showing some positive, showing that the SDGs do provide an accepted framework for conversations that governments can have about CSOs' operating environment, and not just conversations, but bringing them formally into processes. But there is a lack of diversity, and this echoes some of the points that Demo Voulet was making about the smaller, more grassroots rural organisations being a bit left behind, and that's something we have to think about. So we're now going to move to our panel. We've got a very good distinguished panel of colleagues, and mindful of the points been made about gender equality, we're bringing the gender balance back to the final part of the session. So we'll have, I'll introduce the panelists in order of appearance, and they represent different poles of the task team, as well as also bringing in a new partner focusing on statistics and on the indicator. So our first speaker will be Richard Sewakirianga, and he's going to laugh at me for getting his name wrong again. He's my fellow co-chair on the task team, so I acknowledge him in that role, and also our third co-chair, Stephen Okello from Uganda, who's the third part of the team. And Richard is also co-chair of the CSO Partnership for Development Effectiveness, which represents the civil society members, and will be speaking representing them. Then we will hear from Monica Suna, who's dialing into us from Kenya. She's Chief Economist and Head of the Development Effectiveness Secretariat at the National Treasury and Planning of Kenya, and also has the honour of having hosted the first country-level event of the task team to bring multi-stakeholder dialogue on the SDGs into practice. And then we have, from the donor side, joining us from Paris on behalf of the OECD, Ana Fernandez, who's head of unit of the Foresight Outreach and Policy Reform Unit at the OECD DAC, that's the Development Cooperation Directorate in the OECD. And then finally, we'll be joined by Cara Williams, who's dialing in from Canada, and she's Chief Advisor of International Relations at Statistics Canada. And she's also a member of the wonderfully named IAEG SDG, which is the Interagency Expert Group on the SDGs. It's a long title, but it's a really important group because that is the group that decides and monitors and focuses on the measurements for all of the SDGs. So if we get to determine by 2030 whether we've succeeded as an international community or not in achieving the SDGs, the work of that group is going to be the key enabler of that. So I'm going to hand over first to Richard Sawakirianga, to respond to the findings of the study, also from a civil society perspective. So Richard, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Ola, and to all colleagues, the Honorable Minister who has opened the UN Special Rapporteur, our colleagues, the researchers, my fellow co-chairs, Hans and colleagues at the Secretariat. I recognize you. Of course, I'm coming to you from my own home here in Kampala. So you are all a good evening. I know some are just waking up, but for us, it's the evening. I think what I'm supposed to really speak about is what can CSOs do to bridge the gap, the SDG gap at country level. I think there are several things that can be said, and the study has touched on a number of things. But as a point of departure, what I'll do is I will come from the study that we commissioned under the Civil Society Partnership for Development Effectiveness, where we did a study just recently in the month of May to June. We are in about 42 countries where we have our partners. And in that study, we are looking again at the question related to how CSOs are engaging on the SDGs and related processes at country level. And some of the findings do align to what has been touched on by Case and Alan. But the key points which I would think we also found was that one, there is a need to strengthen ownership. That this whole question of ownership, while we talk about it a lot, I think we need to really do a lot more there. And specifically what that will mean is to do a little bit much more domestication of this whole agenda of the SDGs, as well as raise awareness at all levels. So again, the idea of bringing in as many people, the idea of localizing processes, the idea of making SDGs and be understood in their diversity is critically important. But also with that, the idea of ensuring that governments align their budgets, because again, the budgets and the SDGs and would be something that would help with strengthening ownership. The other point which we also found is the whole question of inclusive partnerships through the need for formalizing and institutionalizing CSO engagement. I think as Case has noted, that there is a lot, and Alan, I think, articulated it more, that's happening around the SDGs. Yes, there is something happening everywhere. But in some places, there is a lot of, there are instances of tokenism, and yet what we want to get to is to see how can we ensure that they are formalized and institutionalized processes that actually allow civil society to express themselves, to engage in a manner that is predictable, in a manner that will engage formally. The other is to improve the whole question of transparency and accountability. And this, I think, the special rapporteur also touched a little bit about. But for the SDGs, now knowing that we are in the decade of delivery, I think we can't run away from the need for us to continuously track the results and what we need to do within the context in which we are. How do we track those, but also track them jointly so that we don't have one party having to, do all the reporting and self-praise without listening to critique or to counter narratives. So that is also another important point. And then the need to enhance results focus, I think, is important. I think one of the key points that were brought out by several partners across the world was that the results frameworks that are used to monitor SDGs need to also, in very many ways, be nationalized, but also localized, but also those that bring in as much as possible what is important to ensure that we track both those who are marginalized and those who do not, always get to the fore. So those are some of the things that came out, and the fifth one was around the whole question that we are all dealing with now, which is the global pandemic and the need for transparency and accountability around this pandemic, and how civil society see this as one of the big things that has to be looked at in future. The need to strengthen public health systems at country level to harness the work that civil society brings in terms of the knowledge, and also to ensure that we focus on the impact on the marginalized around this time. So really, this is just to wrap up in a very short time what came out of this work, but it tells you that there is a lot that still needs to be done at country level around the SDGs. There are many gaps that we must fill, but clearly we are not a sort of answers. I think why we are is that the moment we all commit to do more, I think the opportunities are there. The challenge won't go away, but we, with resolve, we can, create the impact that we want to create. I thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, Richard. And I just want to remind people, if they have questions, they can start putting them in the chat function. And now I'm going to pass over to Monica Asuna, who's joining us from Nairobi. Monica, the floor is yours.
Yes. Good evening. I know it's morning to some, and thank you all for coordinating this. I also want to thank the task team and also the speech from the minister and also the keynote speech from Vol. They were very insightful, and then it speaks to us as the task team. So just as an introduction, I'm Monica Asuna, working with the National Treasury Kenya, and also have been a member of the task team for some time now. First of all, I want to appreciate that at the country level, for Kenya, from 2009, we started including the civil society in our national dialogue. We always have national dialogue with various stakeholders in the country supporting our development agenda. So Reality of Aid Africa is our focal point, and it rallies other civil society who are in development effectiveness whenever we have meetings and whenever there's a thematic area to discuss. Based on that, and as a member of the task team, and really wanting to really bring this dialogue at the country level, Kenya hosted the first pilot workshop for the task team in June 2019, and where the team was going further together. And one key outcome of that meeting was that there's need for having a framework of engagement. And we agreed on a partnership framework for CSOs, because we are talking of measuring SDG 17 as relates to the civil society. So without having a coordinated framework, then that measurement may not even work. So based on that, we are already at the country level trying to have organize ourselves to really take that agenda forward. It is something at the heart of the civil society and government on how we can really coordinate ourselves. We must acknowledge that we cannot monitor and measure what we do if we don't work together. And one thing that we've realized and that I can speak to in the country is that with the impact of what is going on, the COVID-19 pandemic, you find that most economies are stressed financially. And this causes that at least we need all the development actors around the table, because most governments right now are experiencing low domestic resource mobilization. So, and for example, Kenya, we've done a bit of, it was passed that certain sectors and certain maybe level of people, there were tax waivers. So this means that with the tax waivers, there's low revenue being mobilized domestically. So this calls for governments to really tap into all the resources that are available, and the resources to civil society will be key in that. How can they be aligned to the national agenda? How can we really work together so that we know what we are doing, and then we bridge that gap in what the government is doing? So realizing the SDGs then calls for more coordinated and aligned resources, a more coordinated approach of how we work together. And this will be something which is key. So in terms of even measurement, it will also call on our own willingness to work together in terms of transparency. You know, if we are going to measure something, and if we are not going to maybe give that information, because in terms of collecting that data, then we have to give that data. So if the data will be with the various individuals and they don't want maybe to share it with government or with the data collection agencies, then it becomes a challenge. So I think it will call for more transparency on how we do business, on how we work, so that we ensure that whatever we want to measure, there's that information available. So I think maybe I won't take much time, but in wrapping up, then I think, and this is something that has been spoken about, we really need to think how to engage the civil society more so in the policy decisions at that level. When we are doing budgets as government, it is also critical so that at the sector level, we are able to really know who is bringing what, and then it becomes, cohesive and comprehensive. So we really need to reorganize ourselves in the way we do business and include all actors. That is really important. But then in doing that, then we really have to build that platform, the dialogue. So the civil society, government, we really need to really continue working together, continue really knocking on the doors of government to really have that space for you, and also to really have that meaningful dialogue, because it will be critical. So that is what I can say for now. But then that platform at the national level of coordinating ourselves is really important, because that is what will formalize how we are working. And for Kenya, it is up to the devolved level, because we are we have a devolved system of governance. So thank you so much, Ola, and thank you. Yeah, good evening.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Monica, and also reminding us in the time of COVID that financial resources are even more limited, so collaboration is much more necessary. I'm now going to pass the floor to Ana Fernandez from the OECD Development Cooperation Directorate. Ana, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you also for the invitation to be in this very interesting discussion. I want to special thank the task team on CSO development effectiveness and enable environment. I think they have been doing a great contribution to this debate, and also the study was very interesting. And what I would like to bring today and to share with you is also the evidence that we have been collecting from the OECD side. As you know, we have we support the DAC, so the Development Assistance Committee, in advancing this agenda. There are three main things that we are doing. The first one was to establish in 2018 a formal dialogue for a framework of dialogue between the Development Assistance Committee and the civil society organizations. And this was very important because, as you know, in the OECD, we have formal dialogues for a long time with trade unions, with business sector, and we are developing now, and only now, the dialogue in a formal, more formal way with also civil society organizations across the OECD, and this was very, very important. We also developed a study, and I wanted to share with you some of the findings, which are quite aligned with the findings that I heard from also and read from the task team study. There are three main blocks of findings. One relates with the way we are as donors. Donors are funding the civil society organizations. And the study that we did, we got answers from all the DAC donors. So it's quite comprehensive. And one of the main findings there is that we are not funding enough partner country CSOs. Only 7% was dedicated to that, and that's an important evidence if we are discussing development effectiveness at the country level. So there is a lot of evidence around financing and what we should be doing better in terms of funding to civil society and through civil society. And then there is another block of evidence that relates with dialogue and engagement in terms of what are the actors that we engage with in terms of civil society. And there also we found out that there is a need to increase in terms of diversity and also in terms of going beyond the usual, what we call the usual suspects as partners, which is also in line with what you find out in your own study. Then there is another part which is related with the dialogue itself between civil society and donors. And then what we found is that in general terms, donors are engaging a lot with civil society at their own country level, but that is not happening so much at the partner country level. And that's something that is also fundamental when we discuss development effectiveness. We also think and analyzed there and got evidence that there is a lot still to be done in terms of ensuring that the practices of funding, but also in terms of partnership, because most of the partnerships are still developed on the basis of projects, and that we need to kind of change or embrace the new reality of different partnerships by ensuring at the same time that we do no harm in terms of CSO accountability and legitimacy, and to ensure that there is that we keep the level of independence and we are respecting that level of independence of CSOs. So a lot of things can be done. And what we did from the study, and my colleagues also are going to share in the chat with the links for that study, we also did another thing besides collecting the evidence. We also analyzed with the first foresight paper ever produced in the Development Cooperation Directorate, we also analyzed scenarios about the impact of digital in terms of civic space. And as you already referred, and our study also shows that evidence, there is a shrink of the civic space. But what we did was to study a little bit what could be the scenarios in terms of digital impact for the civic space in 10 years from now. And of course, also analyzing that on the lens of the COVID-19 and the recent crisis. And there, we also came out with several considerations and action points that donors can already be thinking to anticipate some of the challenges that we are checking in each of the scenarios, but also to already provide, and strengthen the possibility to really reinforce the civic space from now on. And those also relate with, for instance, legal frameworks related with the use of technology. It also relates with the role of training and supporting training for civil society to use that technology, but it also refers to the whole of government approach, for instance, to technology and surveillance when engaging in terms of protecting civic space and freedom of assembly. So saying that, what are now the next steps that we are planning? So the Development Assistance Committee agreed that it's very important to develop more guidance or even a recommendation to ensure that donors can get the incentive and also the clarity that they will need to reinforce the enable environment for civil society. That guidance and recommendation will have three main areas. The first one will be about support and engaging with civil society. The second one will refer to incentivize CSO accountability. And the third one will be about promoting and protecting civic space. And this is something that we will be developing in consultation, of course, with several of you, and of using also the community that we have and the relationship we have with the task team, but also with the community of practice of civil society. Finally, I just wanted to also refer to the question about SDG implementation. We also feel that more work needs to be done in terms of indicators. And as you know, also the GPDC is developing a reflection around this to reinforce that. And also what we will be doing with this guidance / recommendation can be a support for that thinking because it's clear, and we also agree with those that have expressed that position that is important to have a more robust way of monitoring the implementation of SDG 17 related with civil society engagement. Having said that, and to conclude, I think it's very important also to align ourselves with something that we believe is very important, which is to continue to consult with civil society organizations and to continue to consult not only with civil society organizations from OECD countries, but also from partner countries. And we also would like to see more partnerships among different stakeholders. And as you know, we are engaging also a lot with developing guidance for private sector engagement on blended finance, on financing for development. And that's a little bit what we like. And it's a little bit our mission in terms of OECD is to provide that evidence and some food for thoughts for our members to advance their policies and also to advance the SDG implementation. So as we always say in the OECD, we bring some evidence for fostering the debate, and we are very keen to hear also from you during the discussion. And our aim, as you know, it's always to go for better policies for better lives. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Anna. And I think we've had a good roundup both from the donor side, civil society, and of course from partner countries about there is a lot of evidence between all of the three groups that we've generated. We have some data, but the big challenge is to go from analyzing, admiring the problem, and then saying, well, where do we take this to the next stage? So how can we ensure that for the final half decade from 2025 to 2030, that we can meaningfully measure, see how we're doing and do better? So that's a very good moment to introduce Cara Williams. And Cara, welcome to the task team. And I think you bring skills and insights that maybe the rest of us aren't as familiar with. And I think it would be interesting for us to understand what could be the roadmap for us to try and better monitor and measure the inclusion of CSOs in delivering the SDGs. So I'll hand the floor to you now.
Great. Thank you very much, and thanks for inviting me today. It is a real challenge for measuring these. I think the ambitious nature of the SDGs means that government action alone, of course, cannot be enough, and it will take all of society. I think that's clear, citizens, civil society, academia, and the private sector, along with government, to achieve that. But I think it's important to note that in many instances, it is civil society that has boots on the ground and is working directly with the most vulnerable. So the role that civil society plays in the SDGs cannot be understated here. However, for global reporting, finding comparable high quality data at a global level for civil society is a challenge, and we have not quite conquered that yet. So what I propose to talk about is to take a minute to talk about civil society and the targets and indicators for the SDGs, then talk about the IAEG process for the indicators. I think that might help the audience understand the work on the indicators a bit more completely. So in the 2030 agenda targets, civil society is specifically mentioned only once, and that's in target 1717. And that's encourage and promote effective public, private, and civil society partnerships, building on experience and resourcing strategies of partnerships. But it is important to note that civil society is actually mentioned in another indicator, and that's indicator 11.3.2, the proportion of cities with direct participation structure of civil society in urban planning and management that operate regularly and democratically. So, so civil society is actually twice in the targets and indicators. But going back to 1717, prior to the comprehensive review, people may be aware that there was a tier 3 indicator that was the amount of United States dollars committed to public, private, and civil society partnerships. And that indicator stayed a tier 3 indicator. The World Bank was noted as the custodian agency, and the custodian agency is the agency that compiles and is responsible for that indicator. However, several times over the last few years, the World Bank has come to the interagency expert group noting that they don't have data on the civil society component of that indicator. And so during the comprehensive review of the indicators, which just took place in 2020, earlier in the year, and was endorsed by the Statistical Commission, because there was no data, that civil society component of that indicator was dropped. So now the indicator is the amount of in US dollars committed to public-private partnerships for infrastructure. So I think as the task team move forwards, they need to think about what they would like to measure related to civil society. Is it monetary value that you want to measure, or is it something else? I think that's an important discussion that the task team needs to have, because there's lots of ways that you could measure civil society engagement in that. It doesn't necessarily need to be a monetary value. The other thing that I would suggest to the task force is, the 2030 agenda is about leave no one behind, but don't leave the statisticians behind either. Sometimes if you involve us early on, we can provide some insight on, well, we don't know how we would measure that, and ask those questions. Well, what exactly do you mean? Get that clarification so that the task team hasn't spent all their time coming up with something and then presenting it to the IAEG, and the IAEG saying, we don't understand how this is going to, how you're going to actually implement that. So that's my first recommendation, is involve a National Statistics Office in your task team, not to police it, but more to provide the statistical expertise as you're moving forward. Talking about the timing for an inclusion of another indicator. So the IAEG said there would be 2 comprehensive reviews. The first one would be in 2020, and at that point we would revise, add, and delete indicators. And as I mentioned, we've just completed that. The next one is in 2025, and so I think that's the period that you're looking forward to have an indicator. And one of the things that several people have mentioned earlier was talking about transparency, accountability, but I would also say that even in your data collection itself, it's really important to have some sort of consistency for that data. In order to be able to roll up to a global indicator, it's key that the data are comparable across countries. It's key that there has to be some sort of data validation process whereby countries can see themselves in that. It is, and that is really very difficult because many times civil society focuses on a small group or it could be even a region within a country, and so their information doesn't roll up even at a country level. And so then how do you take that information and roll it up to a global level? So there are some real challenges there. So that's why it's really important for you to determine what you want to measure. You know, are you measuring in dollars? Are you measuring in the number of partnerships? Are you measuring in the effectiveness of partnerships? So that's important. The other thing I think is really key is that civil society can be, it doesn't always have to be in the global measures. There's lots of ways that countries can incorporate civil society information into their own national reports. It doesn't make it less important at all. But what it does is it acknowledges that sometimes this data are not comparable. Sometimes they are specific for specific groups. So let me give you a concrete example. In Canada, Statistics Canada, we recognize the importance of civil society data, but at the same time, we also recognize that sometimes it doesn't meet the type of standards for official statistics. So what we've done is we've created a series of 17 fact sheets for the Sustainable Development Goals that focus on the Canadian Indicator Framework, which is a specific Canada Indicator Framework for the SDGs, and the Global Indicator Framework. But on every fact sheet, we have a component of the community spotlight. And in that community spotlight, we focus on civil society information. So some piece of data from civil society. We don't guarantee the quality of that, but we recognize that it takes every player to ensure that we achieve the 2030 agenda. And it is a good way to start engaging with civil society. So there are ways to do that outside of the official frameworks. And one of the things that I think is really important, and when we talk to civil society in Canada, is that we mention that, you know, maybe your data isn't in the Global Indicator Framework, maybe it's not even in the National Indicator Framework, but that doesn't make it not important. So there are ways that you can report on things that are outside of those official indicator frameworks. Having said that, we also we have a quality toolkit that we have on the Statistics Canada website that anybody who is a data provider can use to help ensure the quality of their information, so that potentially in the future it can be used as part of official statistics or as in other reporting frameworks. So I think that's, you know, essentially what I would suggest that the task force does is really come up with what they want to measure, involve the statisticians early, so we can help say, well, we wouldn't know how to measure that, what do you mean, and ask those questions. And then one of the things you would need to do to be ready for the 2025 review, you'd need to be piloted. You need to have tried it, whatever you're doing in all regions, developed and developing countries, to make sure that whatever you're using for data actually works across the globe. And you would need to come, I would suggest coming to the IAAG potentially more often, so don't wait until the 2025 review starts. Come to the IAAG prior to that and have a discussion with them about what they're thinking about it. So I will leave it from there. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Cara. And I think that's exactly what we were looking for, to the practical guidance, but also, you know, we're in 2020, we might think, oh, it's 4 or 5 years to get to proposing an indicator and have it ready for measurement in 2025, but you've stretched out the enormity of the task, and perfection won't be possible, but trying to find something that is meaningful and practical is the challenge. We've gone a little over time, but we have just over 10 minutes left for questions, and there's a couple come through, so I'm going to group, I think, 3 that have come out that are kind of related, I'll ask Clément Voulet in the first instance, and I think one is very much directed to him to respond, and then we'll maybe leave it open for the panelists to get a few responses in. So one of the questions is how local women community-based organisations in conflict zones can be better included in dialogue and policy. I think it was mentioned that they do a lot of the work, they have the knowledge, and when it comes to writing policy documents, they're not in the room. There's a second question about partnerships between academia and CSOs, which I think the researchers anticipated, but also to try and bring the contributions from local civil society. So that gap there, and whether the international NGOs, the larger ones, are a help or a hindrance. I think we want more civil society all of the time, so not less, but it's a good question. And then the final one was maybe looking at the quality of civil society inclusion, which is difficult, but are there things like human rights indicators that could be helpful, existing measures that maybe could translate across? So that's the final question. So Clément, I'll go to you first, and then we will share out the other questions to the other panelists. So floor is yours, Clément.
Thank you very much for the questions, and I think I mean all of the question is more grouping around effectiveness and the participation of a civil society, but I fully understand that the work around the SDGs is sometimes quite, well, like he mentioned, very difficult for some civil society that are working on grassroots in terms of providing kind of indicator and providing their own assessments on how things are going and what are some of the achievements. And I think this is I think that is also in the responsibility of regional bodies and UN body also to be able to assist civil society when they are in this discussion, because this partnership means also that civil society is in the level also so that they can provide meaningful and they can provide quality information. This is why I was also insisting that in relation to the funding, is important also to strengthen the capacity of the civil society to be able also to analyze data, to be able also to provide their analysis on. And since many of the work is done at the grassroots level in terms of providing and trying to fight inequality, but how do we aggregate those things and then put it in a way that it can also be really read clearly in terms of achievement, in terms of gaps. So I think for me it's important, this is where, for example, international civil society can play a role. This is where also UN and other entities that are dealing, intergovernmental entities that are dealing with SDGs should provide support for the grassroots civil society. And I think it's quite the same when we talk about civil society work and the academia. And we know that today there is so much information around also the data, but sometimes it's so difficult to read them for people that are working in grassroots level. And I think your also task team is what you are also providing in terms of making sure that those data can be clearly translated in the way that people can understand their content, but also what they mean really at the grassroots level.
Sorry, Michael. Thank you very much, Clément. I think the question about human rights indicators, and maybe it's not really in the OECD rubric, but it was a suggestion to the OECD, so I might pass that over to Anna.
Sorry, I'm trying to unmute myself, sorry for that. Yes, so in the paper we did on foresight, so on the impact of digital in terms of civic space, we analyzed that, and we have some kind of indicators that also relate with international convention on civil and political rights, and also civic freedom of association, peaceful assembly and expression, including online. So I think we can share that with you in more detail. It's true that the human rights dimension it's an important one and probably should be strength across the different around SDGs. And I think it would be very, very interesting to also have a discussion more focus on that related with the partnerships and how can we bring that dimension a little bit more visible on SDG 17 could be interesting, an interesting discussion, I think. As you know, also in the question related with the new discussions that we are having on the DAC about development effectiveness, that relate with also the global partnership on development effectiveness. This is an issue that is of concern to the donors, and we are getting that feedback from the members of the OECD that they are very concerned with the shrinking of civic space, and they really need and they really want to act upon it in a more effective way. So I just wanted to share this with you.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Anna. And I think it's important to link both effective development and space, because if civil society isn't in the room and having access and being able to help, then we can't achieve the development goals that we want to. Very quickly, one of the three questions was on about getting more data from local civil society, which was to the researchers. So either Case or Alan, I'll ask one of you, maybe Alan was more on the findings. So either one of you, if you could respond quickly on that, and then we'll sum up to more or less finish in time.
Well, I can briefly say, Orla, that we did involve local researchers into the process, and there is a lot of research being done at the local level. Maybe it's not coming through. On the other hand, we also sense there's a lack of resources for that at the local level. Alan, you want to add to that?
No, no, I think it's there is a lot going on, but it's not framed within the aid discourse. So there is really a lot going on, but it's not aided, and therefore we don't have the optic, if we just look at it that way, of what is actually going on in terms of particularly what one could call below the radar. We are only looking at the visibly articulate, formally organized civil society organizations, which I can assure you are a minority of what is going on in any country. And unless we can open up to a much more broader view of civil society below the radar, then we will never understand what the local is all about.
Thank you very much to both of you. I think it's a good summing up of the challenge ahead. I know we have a few more questions coming in, but I think we're close to closing, and we're very grateful to all of you for giving us 90 minutes of your time in all of the different time zones. I think this has been a useful exchange. We from the task team wanted to present the evidence and from the studies, because we felt it was important, and there were both positives and also challenges from that, but also to take the discussion to a new level and to say, well, there is a gap here, and part of the solution to the gap, we feel, is measuring and monitoring better. But I think especially Cara's involvement has shown us that it can be possible. I think we should try, but it's going to be pretty difficult. And there have been a lot of different quality points made. We will have a recording of this available, and I think all of us in the task team will look over, and there's some suggestions and opportunities for us to do more work. And now that our first phase of studies is officially concluded and launched today, there are plenty of ideas and places we can focus on for a next phase. But what's really clear is a lot of different voices are talking about local civil society that's doing the majority of the work and the engagement towards development all around the world in different countries, and how to get their voices, experience, research more heard and recognized. So maybe that is something particularly for us, for a task team, as a takeaway that we can do. I want to really thank all of our speakers very much, all of our panelists. Thank you so much for joining us around the world, and to everybody who has listened in. We really appreciate your engagement. We will invite you if you want to stay in touch with this conversation, because if we're talking about civil society, we should be open and transparent and engaged. And thank you, Cara, for the point to not wait 4 years and come back, but to stay in dialogue with your organization, with your group. I think that's really important. But anybody who wants to continue the dialogue with us and isn't already engaged, please go to our website and get in touch, and we'd be very happy to hear from you. I want to thank the silent partners as well, Hans de Vogt, who's the manager of the Secretariat there in the Netherlands, and all of his team who've done a huge amount of work. I think organising a virtual event is actually more work than a real life event. So hopefully we will be able to all meet in person next year if we come back to the HLPF and see how far we've got and what the new challenges are. I hope we will have progressed on the way to not just 2025, but of course to 2030. So it just remains for me to farewell you all from Dublin. Slán agus beannacht. And again, to thank all of you and all of our speakers for their contributions and for your interesting and thought-provoking questions, which we will take back and look at further. So without further ado, and almost on time, only 3 minutes over, I want to thank all of you very much and wish you all well. Slán and Ish. Bye now.